Can you imagine working for someone for years without them ever truly seeing you? Until one night, everything changes. Gianna Russo never thought that a blind date with only $273 in her pocket would bring her face to face with her boss, one of Chicago's most dangerous mafia bosses, in the most unexpected situation of her life. Gianna Russo looked at herself one last time in the cracked mirror of her tiny studio apartment on Chicago's South Side, feeling butterflies dancing wildly in her stomach. At 27 years old, she'd never had a real date, let alone a blind date arranged through an app with a complete stranger. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the deep burgundy dress that Helena, her only friend, had lent her that morning. "You've got to try at least once," Helena had said with that knowing smile nurses always seem to have. Gianna sighed, knowing her friend was right. She'd been working as a housekeeper in Salvatore Benedetti's mansion for 4 years, a man whispered about in fear across the city, the head of one of Chicago's most powerful crime families. But her social life was practically non-existent. Her days off were spent visiting her dying mother at Cook County Hospital, or picking up extra shifts at the bar just to keep up with the medical bills that kept piling higher than she could count. Tonight would be different. Tonight she dared to dream of being chosen by someone. She took the $273 she'd saved, every penny she had left after paying for her mother's medications, and carefully tucked them into her small clutch purse. The dress was slightly tight. She'd had to skip a few meals this week anyway, but the dark red color made her pale skin glow and brought out her blue-gray eyes in a way that almost made her forget how exhausted she was. Helena had also insisted on lending her black heels, even though they pinched her feet. "Lord, what am I doing?" Gianna whispered while applying the cheap lip gloss she'd bought at the dollar store down the street. Her heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst right out of her chest. She'd been texting with a man who called himself Diego through the app for 3 weeks now. He seemed gentle and hard-working, someone who might understand her simple world of survival and sacrifice. He'd promised to take her to a beautiful restaurant in River North, something that sounded like an impossible dream to a girl who counted every dollar twice. She took a deep breath, grabbed her keys to the rusty old Honda that barely started anymore, and left her crumbling apartment building, carrying a mixture of fear and anticipation she hadn't felt in years. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt almost beautiful. For the first time since her father's blood had stained her childhood memories, she had hope. If you're enjoying this story, smash that like button and share it with someone who loves a good dark romance. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss what happens next. Now let's go back to the moment Gianna stepped into that restaurant, not knowing her entire life was about to change forever. The old Honda groaned as Gianna turned into River North, where glass skyscrapers reflected the city lights like millions of diamonds suspended in the night sky. She'd never come to this area at night, never had a reason to. This was a world of tailored suits and designer dresses, not of a girl wearing a borrowed dress and shoes so tight her toes were slowly going numb. When she pulled up in front of the velvet room, her heart clenched. The restaurant's facade was dressed in deep red velvet drapes and crystal chandeliers that spilled warm golden light through the glass doors. Porsches, Mercedes, and Bentleys lined the curb like a luxury exhibition. Gianna glanced down at her rusted Honda and swallowed hard. She almost wanted to turn the car around and run back to her shabby apartment, but then she remembered Diego's last text from the night before. He'd written that he couldn't wait to see her, that she deserved to be treated like a queen, even if only for one night. Those words had made her cry in the darkness of her empty room, because it had been so long since anyone had said something that beautiful to her. Gianna took a deep breath, checked her face in the rearview mirror one last time, and stepped out of the car. The click of her heels on the sidewalk sounded like her own heartbeat, frantic and unsteady. When she pushed open the heavy door, the scent of expensive candles and delicate food rushed at her. The host at the front desk looked her up and down with the kind of appraisal she knew too well after 4 years of working for the upper class. "I have a reservation," Gianna said, her voice trembling slightly even as she tried to control it, under the name Diego Martinez, a table by the window. The host checked the list, then gave a reluctant nod. She followed him past rows of tables draped in spotless white cloth, where elegant couples laughed softly and raised glasses of red wine. Gianna felt like a black ink stain on white paper, like she didn't belong here for even a second. She sat in the chair pulled out for her, set her small purse on the table, and stared out the window. The clock on the wall pointed to exactly 8 o'clock. Diego would arrive any moment. The first 15 minutes slipped by like honey, slow and heavy. Gianna watched the door, her heart pounding every time someone stepped inside, but none of them were Diego. She looked down at her phone, checked her messages for the 5th time, the 6th, the 10th. His last text was still there, promising he'd be on time, promising he'd reserved the best table for her. 30 minutes. Gianna began to feel eyes gathering on her from all around. A woman in a sequined dress whispered something to her husband, and then they both glanced toward Gianna. A waiter named Preston, with slicked hair and eyes as cold as stone, started passing her table more often than he needed to. Every time he moved by, Gianna could feel the disdain coming off him like the chill from a freezer. She ordered a glass of water just to have a reason to stay seated. Preston set it down with a dry clack, not a word, then turned away. Gianna lifted the glass to her lips, but the water tasted bitter in her throat. She stared out the window, where luxury cars kept sliding past, where happy couples still walked in hand, and she wondered why she'd ever thought tonight would be different. 40 minutes. Diego's phone was still silent. The messages she'd sent weren't answered. The call she made went straight to voicemail. The hope she'd carefully nurtured for 3 weeks began to crack like thin ice under the weight of reality. She looked down at her borrowed dress, her tight shoes, and the meager savings she had gambled on this night. And for the first time, she felt foolish for daring to dream. Preston was walking toward her table with purposeful steps, and Gianna knew what was about to happen next wouldn't be pleasant at all. 45 minutes. The number rang in Gianna's head like a death bell. She'd called Diego 12 times, and every call had gone straight to voicemail, greeted by a pre-recorded voice that sounded cold and indifferent. The messages she'd sent sat there, still and unread. The glass of water on her table had been empty for a long time, and she didn't dare ask for more because she couldn't stand to meet Preston's contempt one more time. But she didn't have to ask, because he was already moving toward her, with the solid, deliberate steps of someone about to carry out a sentence. Preston stopped at her table, hands clasped behind his back, chin lifted as if he were looking down at an insect. "Ma'am," he said, loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear, "you've been sitting here for nearly an hour without ordering. I have to ask you to either place an order or give up the table for real guests." Gianna felt heat rush into her face. She opened the menu for the first time since she'd sat down, and her heart sank when she saw the prices. The cheapest appetizer was $60. A small bowl of soup, barely the size of her fist, cost the same as a week of her rent. She swallowed hard, trying to keep her voice steady. "Please give me a few more minutes. My friend is about to arrive." Preston let out a snort, a small sound packed with all the disdain he could gather. "You said that 45 minutes ago," he replied, his voice cold as ice. "I think we both know no one's coming." The words hit Gianna like a slap across the face in broad daylight. She heard whispers from the nearby tables, soft giggles that weren't fully held back. A woman wearing a diamond necklace as thick as a thumb covered her mouth as she said something to the man beside her, and they both stared in Gianna's direction. "I'll order right now," Gianna said, her voice shaking even as she tried to control it. She looked down at the menu again, desperate to find anything affordable with the last of her remaining cash, but even a single cocktail here cost $35, and she still needed gas money to get home. She still had to buy her mother's medicine tomorrow. Preston waited exactly 3 seconds before speaking again, and this time his voice was even louder, loud enough that an entire corner of the restaurant turned to look. "Ma'am, I think you're in the wrong place. This is the Velvet Room, not some fast food joint on the south side. I'm going to have to ask you to leave immediately before I call security." Gianna felt as if she'd been stripped bare in front of a crowd. Every eye in the restaurant was on her now. On her borrowed dress that fit a little too tight, on her cheap shoes, on her face burning red with humiliation. She heard someone whisper clearly that she must have come to the wrong place, and someone else say that people like her shouldn't try to reach for places that didn't belong to them. Her heart hurt as if it were being torn into pieces, but she refused to let a single tear fall. She'd cried enough. She'd cried when her father was shot dead in front of her when she was 12. She'd cried when her mother's cancer diagnosis came back. She'd cried alone in a pitch-dark apartment while medical bills piled higher than she could count. She wasn't going to let these strangers see her weak. Gianna rose slowly, pushed the chair in with a careful gentleness. She lifted her head, even though her legs were trembling so hard she wondered how she was still standing. She looked straight into Preston's eyes, unblinking, not backing down. "Thank you for reminding me where I belong," she said, her voice strangely calm. Then she turned, clutching her small purse, the the weight of her meager life savings feeling as light and fragile as her shattered hope, and walked toward the entrance. Every step was a battle. She could feel dozens of eyes tracking her every movement, waiting for her to stumble, wanting to see her break so they'd have a story to tell over brunch tomorrow. But Gianna didn't stumble. She walked with her back straight and her head high, even as she was falling apart into a million pieces inside. She was almost at the door, her hand already on the freezing metal bar, when the door suddenly opened from the other side, and Gianna's world stopped. The door swung open, and a rush of cold air spilled in with 3 shadowed figures. Gianna froze with her hand still on the metal bar when she recognized the man stepping over the threshold. Salvatore Benedetti, hair boss, the man whose house she'd cleaned for 4 years. Yet she'd never stood this close to him before. He was taller than she'd imagined from afar, at least 6'2", with broad shoulders hidden beneath a perfectly tailored black suit. His black hair was combed straight back, revealing a sharp, angular face with a jawline that looked carved from stone and a faint scar running along his chin. But what stole Gianna's breath was his eyes, black as obsidian, deep as a bottomless pit, and so cold she felt the temperature in the room drop by a few degrees. 2 men followed behind him, one as big as a bear with a scarred face she recognized as Tommy, the head of security, and another man she'd never seen before. The 3 of them entered like they owned the place, and maybe, in some way, they really did. The entire restaurant fell silent, as if someone had pressed a mute button. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Forks halfway to mouths hung motionless in the air. Even Preston, who moments ago had been strutting like a king, now stood stiff with a face gone pale as paper. Everyone knew who Salvatore Benedetti was. Everyone knew what happened to people who dared to offend him. Gianna stepped aside to make room, hoping she could slip out unnoticed. She just wanted to leave this place, go back to her shabby apartment, and bury tonight in the long list of painful memories she tried to forget. But she'd barely taken 1 step when Preston's voice rose behind her, trembling, yet still trying to sound professional. "Mr. Benedetti, it's an honor to welcome you. As for this girl, I'm requesting that she leave because she can't afford to pay, and we'll call the police if necessary." Gianna went rigid. She turned and caught Salvatore's gaze locked on her. For the first time in 4 years, he was truly looking at her. Not the quick glance as he passed by like he always did. Not the absent nod when she lowered her head in greeting. This was a real look, as if he were trying to read every line written on her soul. His dark eyes met her gray-blue ones, and something shifted inside that icy stare. Gianna didn't know what it was. She only knew she didn't lower her head. She didn't cry. She didn't flinch, even though she was standing in front of one of the most dangerous men in Chicago. She simply stood there, back straight, chin lifted, showing every ounce of wounded pride she refused to hide. Tommy tilted his head and whispered into Salvatore's ear. Gianna couldn't hear what he said, but she guessed it had to do with the meeting that brought them here. Maybe Salvatore's partner hadn't shown up either. Maybe he'd been abandoned tonight too, even if the reason was worlds away from being deceived by an online date. Salvatore listened, gave a brief nod, then let his gaze sweep across the restaurant. His eyes stopped on Preston, and the waiter shrank like a rabbit facing a wolf. He looked like he was about to turn and walk away. Gianna could see it in the slight twist of his body toward the door. But then Preston opened his mouth again, maybe so frightened he couldn't control his words. "I'm sorry you had to witness this. We'll call the police to deal with her right away so she won't disturb you." The police. The words rang through the quiet room like a bell. Gianna felt her blood run cold. If the police came, they'd ask for papers. They'd ask why she was here. They'd look at her the way Preston had, the way everyone in this restaurant had. She'd end up on a record, maybe fined, maybe lose her job at the Benedetti estate, the only job that was keeping her mother's hospital bills paid. But before she could say anything, Salvatore stepped forward. He moved with the deadly smoothness of a predator, each step radiating power and danger. He stopped between Gianna and Preston and turned to face the waiter. His voice was quiet, but so cold Gianna felt a chill crawl up her spine. "Shut up." 2 words, and Preston fell silent instantly. He stood there with his mouth open, not daring to make another sound. Salvatore turned to Gianna, and this time his gaze softened a fraction, though it still couldn't be called warm. He studied her for a beat as if weighing something, then spoke loudly enough for the entire restaurant to hear. "She's my guest." Gianna wasn't sure she'd heard him right. She stood there, stunned, while Salvatore Benedetti, the most powerful mafia boss in Chicago, The man whose floors she'd scrubbed and whose clothes she'd folded for 4 years had just declared in front of everyone that she was his guest. And from that moment on, Gianna Russo's life would never be the same again. Salvatore set his hand on the back of her chair and pulled it out, a courteous gesture Gianna didn't think anyone had ever offered her in her life. She stood there for a beat, unsure whether she should sit, unsure whether this was real or just some strange dream she'd wake from in her shabby apartment. But Salvatore's eyes didn't give her a choice. They commanded without words. Gianna sat. Preston vanished as if the floor had swallowed him whole. Another waiter, younger and clearly more terrified, appeared at their table with a menu trembling in his hands. Salvatore didn't bother looking at it. He named dishes in smooth Italian, not asking Gianna, not needing to know what she liked or what she might be allergic to. That was how a man used to controlling everything behaved, and Gianna realized she didn't have the right to object in this moment. Tommy and the other bodyguard took a table nearby, far enough to give them the illusion of privacy, but close enough to intervene if needed. Gianna could feel Tommy's gaze burning into her back, suspicious and alert. She didn't blame him. She'd be suspicious too if she were in his place. The air between her and Salvatore was taut, like a string about to snap. She didn't know what to say, didn't know where to look. She was used to being invisible in his world, used to lowering her head and quietly doing her work. Now, seated across from him, beneath the flicker of candlelight, she felt like she'd been placed under a microscope. The food arrived with unnatural speed, each dish arranged like a work of art on spotless white porcelain. Gianna stared down at her plate, not knowing where to begin, not knowing which utensil belonged to which course. She'd cleaned up after lavish dinners at the Benedetti estate hundreds of times, but she'd never been allowed to sit at the table as a guest. Salvatore watched her in silence for a long time. He cut a piece of veal, lifted it to his mouth, chewed slowly, and never took his eyes off her for a single second. Gianna felt hunted, with nowhere to run. Then he spoke, his voice low and steady, like a distant drum. "You work in my house." Gianna nearly dropped the fork in her hand. She looked up at him, her heart hammering in her chest. He knew. Of course he knew. She'd told herself she was invisible to him, that he'd never notice an ordinary maid like her. But she'd been wrong. 4 years, Salvatore continued. My study every Wednesday and Saturday. You always leave an espresso on my desk at 11 o'clock at night, even though no one ever asked you to do that. Gianna opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She hadn't known he noticed. She'd started doing it in her 2nd year, when she realized he was always up late in the study alone, and she thought a hot cup of coffee might help him stay awake. It had been a small gesture, a habit she kept in silence, never imagining anyone would recognize it. I know everything that happens in my house, Salvatore said, his voice dropping even lower. But knowing doesn't mean seeing. There are things we choose to see, and things we choose to ignore. Gianna understood what he meant. She'd ignored a lot over the past 4 years. The smears of blood on the floor she scrubbed away before dawn. The tense meetings behind closed doors she never asked about. The faces that came and went, and some that never appeared again. She knew her boss wasn't just a wealthy businessman, but she chose not to see, because seeing meant danger. "And why did you come here tonight?" Salvatore asked, setting his knife and fork down and resting his chin on his hand as he looked at her. Gianna hesitated for a moment, then decided to tell the truth. She had nothing left to lose, and this man clearly wasn't the kind who could be fooled by clumsy lies. "A date from an app," she answered, her voice quiet but not ashamed. "He promised he'd come, but he didn't." Something flickered across Salvatore's eyes, too fast for her to catch. Then he nodded slowly, as if she'd confirmed something he'd already suspected. "Me too," he said. "Not a date. A business meeting. The partner didn't show." She understood what he didn't say. In Salvatore Benedetti's world, a cancelled appointment wasn't just rude. It could be a trap. It could be a declaration of war. And if that was true, she was sitting at dinner with a man who might be hunted even as they spoke. But strangely, it didn't make her afraid. Maybe she was too tired to be afraid. Maybe because, for the first time in a long time, someone was truly seeing her, even if that someone was a man the entire city feared. The dinner ended in a heavy silence. When Gianna stood to thank him and leave, Salvatore rose as well. "I'll take you home," he said. Not a question or an offer, but a declaration that couldn't be argued with. Gianna shook her head, trying to refuse. "I have a car, sir. My old Honda is parked outside." Salvatore looked at her in a way that made every protest die in her throat. "That car will be brought back to you by my people in the morning. Tonight you're coming with me." It was an order, and Gianna had worked in his house long enough to know that no one refused Salvatore Benedetti's orders. She nodded, too drained to argue after a long night that had wrung her dry. Tommy opened the door of the sleek black Bentley parked right in front of the restaurant. Gianna stepped inside and caught the scent of expensive leather and a faint trace of woodsy cologne. She'd never sat in a car like this before. At the estate, she'd only seen them from a distance, while she wiped windows or swept the courtyard. Salvatore slid in beside her, keeping just enough space that they didn't touch, yet close enough that she could feel the warmth coming off his body. Tommy took the driver's seat, and the other guard sat up front. The car glided through Chicago's streets, city lights streaking across the windows like falling stars. No one spoke. Gianna stared out at the passing buildings, forcing herself to focus on the skyline drifting behind them, instead of the overwhelming presence of the man beside her. She could feel him watching her, even though she didn't dare turn to confirm it. The air in the car was stretched tight like a string pulled to its limit, ready to snap at any moment. Then Salvatore's phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen, his brows drawing together slightly, and answered. "What?" he said in Italian, his voice so cold. Gianna felt a chill run down her spine, even though he wasn't speaking to her. Gianna went rigid. She understood Italian. Not much, but enough to catch the important words. Her father, Antonio Russo, had worked for Italians before he was killed. He'd taught her a few basics when she was little, and she'd taught herself more through the lonely years after he was gone. She heard the words, tradition, betrayal, handle it. She heard a name she didn't know, and the way Salvatore said it told her that man wouldn't be alive much longer. She pretended she hadn't heard. She kept her eyes on the window, her face completely empty, the way she'd done hundreds of times while cleaning rooms in the estate that still carried the faint scent of gunpowder. Don't hear, don't see, don't know. That had been her survival rule for 4 years. Salvatore ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket. He didn't explain, and she didn't ask. The silence returned, but this time it carried something different. Heavier, more dangerous. Gianna had just heard what she wasn't supposed to hear, and she was sure Salvatore knew it. The car left the polished glow of River North and moved through streets that grew darker and more deserted. When they entered the south side, Gianna could feel the atmosphere change. She didn't need to look to know Salvatore was taking in the crumbling buildings along the road, the walls covered in graffiti, the groups of young men gathered on corners with wary eyes. This was her world, and it was as far from his world as light was from shadow. The car stopped in front of Gianna's apartment building. She looked out and felt shame rise up and lodge in her throat. The 5-story red brick building had gone gray with dirt and time. A rusted iron fire escape hung off one side, looking like it could collapse at any moment. The window of her apartment on the 3rd floor had a long crack she'd taped over to keep out the winter wind. "This is where you live," Salvatore said, not a question. His jaw tightened, a small twitch at his temple as if he were grinding his teeth. Gianna didn't know if it was anger or pity, but she wanted neither. "Yes," she answered evenly. "Thank you for bringing me home." She reached for the door handle, but Salvatore spoke and stopped her. "Don't call me sir." Gianna turned back to him, confused. For 4 years, she'd always called him Sir or Mr. Benedetti. It was the unspoken rule for the help. "Call me Salvatore," he said, his black eyes fixed on hers. "At least when no one else is around." Gianna didn't know what that meant. She didn't know why her heart suddenly beat faster, why the air in the car had grown hard to breathe. She only knew she couldn't look away from him, even though she knew she should. "Yes," she whispered. "Salvatore." His name on her lips tasted strange, sweet and dangerous at the same time, like dark chocolate laced with poison. He didn't say anything else, only gave a short nod. Gianna opened the door and stepped out, the cold Chicago night slapping her face. She walked toward the building entrance, back straight, steps steady even as everything inside her tangled into chaos. She could feel Salvatore's gaze following every step until she pushed the heavy door and disappeared inside. That night, Gianna lay on the narrow bed in her dark apartment, staring at the cracked ceiling, unable to sleep. She replayed every moment of the evening, from the humiliation at the restaurant to the way Salvatore had walked in and changed everything. She remembered his dark eyes on her, the way he'd said her name, the warmth of him beside her in that luxury car. She told herself she was losing her mind. He was her boss, He was mafia. He was everything she should stay far away from. At the same time, in the mansion on the Gold Coast, Salvatore sat in his dark study, a glass of whiskey in his hand that he hadn't taken a single sip of. He stared out the window, but his mind was somewhere else, in a crumbling building on the south side, in gray-blue eyes that held no fear, only wounded pride. He lifted his phone and called Tommy. His voice was calm, but it carried the weight of an order. Find out everything about Gianna Russo. Everything. On Monday morning, Gianna stood at the Benedetti estate gates with her heart pounding wildly in her chest. She'd spent all of Sunday wondering if she should come back, wondering if everything would change after Friday night, wondering if Salvatore would fire her because she'd seen too much. But in the end, her mother's hospital fees and the pile of bills crushing her from every side didn't give her any other choice. She stepped through the heavy iron gate, nodded to the guard the way she always did, and walked into the vast mansion she'd known corner by corner for 4 years. Everything looked the same. The ivory walls, the expensive oil paintings, the perfectly trimmed green plants. But Gianna knew something had changed. She could feel it in the way the old butler looked at her with quiet curiosity, in the way the other staff whispered when she passed. Someone had said something. Rumors spread through this house like fire across a dry field. Gianna ignored it and started her work. By Wednesday, she carried her bucket and cleaning cloth into the study as usual. She pushed open the heavy wooden door, stepped inside, and froze. Salvatore was sitting there. In 4 years, she'd never once seen him in the study in the morning when she came to clean. He was always gone early or working upstairs, leaving this room empty for her to wipe down. But today he sat behind the large oak desk, a file open in front of him, his dark eyes lifting to her the moment she entered. "Sorry," Gianna stammered, taking a step back. "I didn't know you. I didn't know you were in here. I'll come back later." "Do your work," Salvatore said, his voice even, but not as cold as she remembered. "I don't need you changing your schedule." Gianna stood there for a moment, unsure what she was supposed to do. Then she nodded and began to clean, trying to keep her hands from shaking as she felt his gaze tracking every movement. Before she left, Salvatore gave her a nod, a small, brief gesture, but completely different from the indifference of the past 4 years, and that was only the beginning. In the days that followed, Gianna started noticing the change more clearly. Salvatore was no longer a ghost gliding past her as if she didn't exist. When she walked down the hallway, he nodded. When she was wiping the living room windows, he stopped and asked if she needed anything. Once, when she nearly bumped into him on the staircase landing, he reached out, steadied her by the elbow, and asked if she was all right. His voice genuinely concerned. The other staff began whispering more. Gianna heard them in the kitchen, in the laundry room, in the hallway, when they thought she wasn't nearby. They said she'd done something to catch the boss's attention. They said she was trying to seduce him to change her fate. One person even said she must have slept with him. Gianna ignored it all. She was used to being judged wrong, used to being misunderstood. She kept her head down, did her work, and tried not to think about those dark eyes watching her more and more often. Then, one afternoon, a sleek black Mercedes pulled up hard in front of the mansion. The door opened, and a woman stepped out. Gianna was cleaning the living room windows and had a perfect view of the front drive. The woman looked about 60, her silver hair swept into an elegant chignon, her face sharp with black eyes identical to Salvatore's. She wore a cream Chanel dress and a heavy strand of pearls around her neck, and every step carried the power and arrogance of someone used to being obeyed. Carlotta Benedetti, Salvatore's mother. Gianna had heard of her but had never met her. She lived in a separate estate in the suburbs and rarely came here. But today she came, and the first thing she did after stepping inside was turn and look straight at Gianna. Her gaze was ice cold, assessing and invasive, as if she were peeling Gianna apart layer by layer. Gianna lowered her head in greeting the way she'd been taught and kept working, but she could feel that stare burning into her back all afternoon. At the same time, in the study, Tommy set a thick file down on the desk in front of Salvatore. "This is everything I could find on her," Tommy said, his tone neutral but his eyes filled with suspicion. "You sure you want to read this?" Salvatore didn't answer. He opened the file and began to read. Gianna Russo, 27 years old, born in Chicago. Father Antonio Russo, served as a driver for the Benedetti family for 10 years. Shot and killed 15 years ago in a hit. Gianna, then 12, was present at the scene. Salvatore stopped on that detail. She watched her father die. He kept reading. Mother Kathleen Russo, maiden name Kowalski, Irish heritage, currently receiving end-stage cancer treatment at Cook County Hospital. Medical bills have accumulated to more than $80,000. Gianna works 2 jobs to cover the costs. Housekeeper by day, bar server by night. Estimated average sleep time approximately 4 hours per day. Salvatore read the final page again and again, where the details of Gianna's finances were listed. She makes $9 an hour at the bar, $12 an hour working for him. She eats 1 meal a day to save money. She hasn't bought new clothes in 2 years. She's 3 months behind on rent. He stared at the file longer than he usually stared at anything, longer than he'd ever stared at any other file. And something in his chest, something he'd thought had died a long time ago, began to stir. 1 week after Mrs. Benedetti's visit, another guest appeared at the estate. Gianna was wiping down a table in the living room when she heard the sharp click of high heels on marble, a clear laugh that felt carefully measured, and expensive perfume spreading through the air like a declaration of war. She looked up and saw a woman step inside. So beautiful it stole Gianna's breath. Glossy black hair fell down her back, flawless olive skin without a single blemish, large brown eyes framed by precise eyeliner, and lips painted a blood red. She wore a tight white dress that hugged every lethal curve and showed off legs that seemed to go on forever. Everything about her radiated wealth, power, and danger. Francesca Carbone. Gianna knew who she was even though they'd never met. She'd heard the other staff whisper about Salvatore's former fiancée, the daughter of Vittorio Carbone, boss of the biggest rival family. Their engagement had collapsed 3 years ago in a scandal no one dared to mention, but Gianna had heard enough to understand that Francesca had betrayed Salvatore in a way that couldn't be forgiven. Francesca glided past Gianna as if she didn't exist and walked straight into the study where Salvatore was working. The door closed behind her, but it wasn't thick enough to keep the voices from spilling out. Gianna knew she shouldn't eavesdrop, but her feet wouldn't move. Sal. Francesca's voice was sweet like honey mixed with poison. I know we've had disagreements in the past, but my father wants reconciliation. The families would be stronger if they unite. A marriage between you and me would end a war that's lasted decades. Salvatore's voice came back, cold and sharp as a blade. A marriage to the woman who betrayed me and worked with my enemies? How stupid do you think I am? I explained it already, Francesca said, her voice trembling slightly as if she were holding her anger in by force. It was a misunderstanding. I was coerced. I love you, Sal. I've always loved you. Salvatore laughed, a sound with no warmth in it. Get out of my house, Francesca, and tell your father that if he wants peace, he should send a real offer instead of sending his daughter like a cheap gift. The door flew open and Francesca stepped out, her face pale with fury even as she tried to hold on to composure. In that instant, Gianna happened to pass the study door, and she caught Salvatore's eyes inside. Just a flicker, 1 short second, but it was enough for Francesca to notice. Francesca's brown eyes narrowed, sliding from Salvatore to Gianna and back to Salvatore, and a cold smile curved on her lips, as if she'd just discovered something precious. Francesca didn't leave right away. She drifted through the mansion, saying she wanted to see the place where she'd almost become the mistress of the house. And somehow she ended up in the kitchen, where Gianna was washing dishes alone. Gianna felt Francesca's presence before she even saw her. She looked up and found the woman leaning in the doorway, arms crossed, a sneer resting on her mouth. "So you're the maid everyone's whispering about?" Francesca said, her voice sweet in a way that was obviously fake. The little girl from the south side who caught Salvatore Benedetti's attention. How impressive. Gianna stopped, dried her hands on her worn apron, and turned to face Francesca. She didn't lower her head. She didn't step back. "I'm only the housekeeper, ma'am. I don't know what you're talking about." Francesca moved closer, her heels clicking on tile. She stopped less than a step away, close enough that Gianna could smell the heavy perfume and see the thick makeup on her face. "Let me give you some free advice," Francesca said, lowering her voice until it became a threat. "Girls like you shouldn't dream too high. This world has its rules. You're a maid. You'll always be a maid. Don't think a few looks from Salvatore mean anything. He's only killing time, and when he gets bored, you'll be thrown away like trash." Gianna met Francesca's eyes without blinking, without shaking. Inside her, something boiled, but on the outside she was ice. "I'm not dreaming of anything, ma'am. I'm doing my job." And my job doesn't include listening to advice from people who weren't invited. Francesca went still. She clearly wasn't used to being answered like that, especially not by a maid. For a moment, the sweet mask slipped, and Gianna saw the real cruelty behind those brown eyes. Then Francesca laughed, a cold sound that echoed through the empty kitchen. "You've got nerve," she said. "But nerve doesn't save lives in this world. Remember what I told you." Then she turned and walked away, the click of her heels fading until it disappeared completely. Gianna stood there for a long time, gripping the edge of the sink until her knuckles went white. She didn't know who she'd just made an enemy of, but she knew she couldn't back down. She'd backed down her whole life. That same day, in the study, Salvatore received Tommy's report from the investigation he'd ordered after the night at the restaurant. The man named Diego that Gianna had planned to meet didn't exist. It was a fake identity, and behind that fake identity was Bruno Carbone, Francesca's brother, a bastard of 28 known for playing with women and tossing them aside. Both failed meetings, Gianna's and his, had been traps laid by the Carbone family. The Carbones had initially targeted any low-level staff member through social media to find a weakness in the estate's security. But the moment Salvatore publicly protected Gianna at the restaurant, Bruno realized he could pivot his plan from simple espionage to a high-stakes kidnapping to destroy Salvatore's heart. Salvatore stared at Bruno Carbone's photo in the file, his dark eyes lighting with a flame only those who truly knew him would recognize. It was the fire of a man about to take revenge, and Bruno Carbone was going to pay. 1 week after the confrontation with Francesca, Gianna was cleaning the study the way she always did, when she accidentally bumped a stack of old files lined up on a high shelf. The papers spilled to the floor like falling snow, and Gianna dropped to her knees to gather them up one by one. She had no intention of reading. She knew the rule. Don't look, don't see, don't know. But then a name jumped out at her, clear and sharp as a blade driven straight through her heart. Antonio Russo, her father's name. Gianna froze. Her heart skipped a beat, then thundered as if it wanted to break through her ribs. Her hands shook as she opened the file, her eyes racing across neat typed lines. What she read made the ground beneath her collapse. Antonio Russo, loyal driver for the Benedetti family since the age of 22, trusted by Giovanni Benedetti, Salvatore's father, like family, assassinated 15 years ago by the Carbone family in retaliation after he accidentally witnessed their illegal transaction, shot 7 times in front of his 12-year-old daughter. Gianna remembered that day. She remembered the gunshots. She remembered the way her father went down, blood pouring from the holes in his chest, his eyes still wide and fixed on her until the light inside them finally went out. She remembered screaming until she lost her voice, clinging to his body until the police tore her away. For 15 years, she hadn't known who killed her father. The police said it was a robbery. Her mother told her not to ask again, and she buried that question alongside the childhood that had been stolen from her. But now she knew the truth. Her father had died because of the Benedetti family. Her father had died because of the house she'd been cleaning for 4 years, because of the man she'd begun to feel something for, something she didn't dare name. Gianna stood, the file clenched in her fist, and went straight to Salvatore's office upstairs. She didn't knock. She shoved the door open and stepped in like a storm. Salvatore sat behind his desk, his dark eyes lifting to her with a flash of surprise he rarely let show. But before he could speak, Gianna threw the file onto the desk, papers scattering. "Explain," she said, her voice trembling but not weak. Her eyes burned as she stared straight at him. "Explain why my father's name is in your files. Explain why he died because of your family." Salvatore looked down at the papers spread across his desk, then back at Gianna. He didn't look shocked. He didn't try to deny it. He just sat there, calm as water without a ripple, and it made Gianna want to scream. "You know now," Salvatore said evenly. "Sooner or later you were going to find out." Gianna felt like she'd been slapped. "You knew. You knew from the beginning." "Since I read the file on you 2 weeks ago," Salvatore replied. "Antonio Russo was my father's man. He was more loyal than blood, and when he died, my father went to the funeral himself, even though he knew it was dangerous." "Then why didn't you tell me?" Gianna shouted, her voice cracking. "Why did you let me work here for 4 years without knowing who killed my father? Why did you look at me like I mattered when you were hiding this truth?" Salvatore stood, came around the desk, and moved toward her. Gianna stepped back, but he stopped and kept his distance, his black eyes on her with something that looked almost like pain. Because you didn't need more weight, he said. You were already carrying enough. But there's something you need to know. After your father died, my father sent money to your family every month, enough for your mother to live and to raise you. When my father died, I kept doing it. The money your mother receives each month, the money that helped you pay tuition, that helped you survive your hardest years, came from the Benedetti family. Gianna felt as if another knife had been driven into her. She remembered the envelopes of cash her mother received every month, the envelopes her mother always said came from a church charity fund. Her whole life had been held up by the money of the people who had indirectly caused her father's death. I don't want blood money, she said, her voice tight. I don't want your pity. I don't want anything from this family. Salvatore watched her longer than he usually watched anyone, his dark eyes unreadable. Then he spoke, his voice low and sorrowful, in a way Gianna had never heard from him before. Everything in this life has blood on it, Gianna. The food you eat, the clothes you wear, the roof over your head. Somewhere, someone bled or sweated so you could have those things. The question isn't whether the money has blood on it. The question is whether you choose to see or you choose to turn away. Gianna couldn't take it anymore. She turned and ran out of the office, leaving Salvatore alone amid the fluttering sheets of paper. She ran down the hall, down the stairs, out of the mansion, and didn't stop until she was inside her old Honda and slammed the door shut. And for the first time in 15 years, since the day her father died, Gianna Russo cried. Tears streamed down her cheeks like rivers dammed for too long, finally breaking loose. She cried for her father. She cried for the truth she'd just learned. And she cried because one part of her, a part she hated herself for having, still wanted to go back to that mansion, go back to the man with eyes as dark as night and a voice that made her forget how to breathe. 3 days after the confrontation with Salvatore, Gianna still hadn't gone back to the mansion. She called in to request leave, lied that she was sick, even though the truth was she couldn't bear the idea of seeing him right now. She spent more time at the hospital with her mother, as if her mother's presence could untangle the chaos inside her head. But fate didn't give her time to heal. At 3 o'clock in the morning, Gianna's phone rang in her pitch-dark apartment. She opened her eyes, her heart hammering with the bad instinct she'd learned to trust through years of pain. The screen showed Cook County Hospital, and everything inside her went rigid. She answered. The voice on the other end was cold and professional. Miss Russo, your mother just had a heart attack. She's in critical condition. We need to perform an emergency coronary artery bypass within 2 hours, or she won't make it. Gianna didn't remember how she got dressed, didn't remember how she flew down the stairs, didn't remember how she drove to the hospital. She only remembered standing at the emergency department desk, her shaking hands gripping the edge of the counter, while a financial officer in a gray suit explained the cost. This surgery costs $50,000, the man said, his voice steady as if he were reciting a restaurant menu instead of handing down a death sentence for her mother. Mrs. Russo's Medicaid only covers a small portion. You need to put down at least $30,000 before we can proceed. Gianna felt like she was sinking to the bottom of the ocean. $30,000. She didn't have $30,000. She didn't have $3,000. In her account right now there was less than $200, and her credit card had been maxed out for a long time. I don't have that kind of money, she said, her throat tight. Please, she's my mother. She's the only person I have left. The officer looked at her with a gaze Gianna had seen too many times in her life. The gaze of someone used to saying no, used to watching people like her collapse right in front of him. I understand your situation, he said, understanding nothing at all. We have financial assistance programs. You can apply for review, or you can consider options regarding medical debt, including bankruptcy. I can give you some paperwork to look over. Bankruptcy. The word rang in Gianna's head like a death bell. He was asking her to declare bankruptcy while her mother was dying in an emergency room a few meters away. He was offering her paperwork while her mother's heart could stop at any moment. Gianna collapsed into a chair in the waiting area, both hands clutching her head, and for the first time in her life she felt completely hopeless. She'd fought her whole life. She'd worked 2 jobs, slept 4 hours a day, skipped meals to save money for her mother. She'd done everything she could do. And it still wasn't enough. It had never been enough. She didn't know how long she sat there. Maybe 5 minutes. Maybe half an hour. Time stopped meaning anything when she was facing the loss of the last person in the world who still loved her. Then she heard footsteps. Heavy, steady, familiar in a way that made her heart twist. She looked up, and Salvatore Benedetti stood in front of her. He wore his usual black suit, but his tie had been loosened and his hair was slightly disheveled, as if he'd rushed straight out of bed. Tommy stood behind him, his face unreadable, but his eyes on Gianna carried something that looked almost like pity. "What are you doing here?" Gianna asked, her voice rough. "Tommy told me," Salvatore said. "I have people monitoring your mother's condition at this hospital." Gianna wanted to be angry. She wanted to scream that he had no right to insert himself into her life, that he and his family had already taken enough. But she had no strength left. She just sat there, hollow and desperate. Salvatore didn't say anything else. He walked to the desk where the financial officer sat and pulled a sleek black credit card from inside his jacket. "Pay every cost for Kathleen Russo," he said, his voice leaving no room for debate. "Surgery, recovery, medication, a private room, all of it, and do it immediately." The officer stared at the card, then at Salvatore, his face going pale as he realized who he was standing in front of. "Yes, sir. Immediately, sir." Gianna wanted to stand up and refuse. She wanted to say she didn't need his help, that she didn't want to owe him anything. But this was her mother's life, and between pride and losing her mother, she had no choice at all. Everything after that moved fast. Doctors ran back and forth, her mother was rushed into surgery, and Gianna was led to the family waiting room. Salvatore sat down in the chair beside her, keeping just enough space that he didn't touch her, but close enough that she could feel his presence. He didn't speak. He didn't try to comfort her with empty words. He just sat there, beside her, through the endless hours while the doctors fought to save her mother's life. And somehow, his silence comforted her more than any words ever could. The surgery lasted 6 hours. 6 hours that Gianna sat on a hard chair in the waiting room, her eyes locked on the operating room doors, praying to a God she wasn't sure she still believed in. Salvatore sat beside her the entire time, not speaking a word, only handing her a cup of coffee whenever she started to slump with exhaustion. When the doctor came out to announce the operation was successful, Gianna nearly collapsed with relief. Her mother was moved into intensive care, and 2 days later, she woke up. Gianna was sitting by the bed when Kathleen Russo's pale blue eyes slowly opened. She was so weak she seemed almost translucent, her skin white as paper, but her cracked, dry lips still tried to form a smile when she saw her daughter. "Gianna," she whispered, her voice rough from the breathing tube. "My girl." "Mom." Gianna gripped her mother's hand, trying to keep her voice from shaking. "Don't talk too much. You need to rest." But Kathleen didn't listen. Her eyes moved slowly across the room and stopped in the far corner, where Salvatore stood leaning against the wall, silently watching. She frowned faintly, then looked back at Gianna with quiet curiosity. "Who is that?" she asked weakly. Gianna turned to Salvatore, then back to her mother, unsure how to explain. "This is Salvatore Benedetti. My boss. He helped. He paid for your surgery." Kathleen was silent for a long moment, her eyes studying Salvatore with the surprising sharpness of a woman hovering close to death. Then she watched the way he looked at her daughter, the way he stood there like a guard, the way his dark eyes softened every time they landed on Gianna. And she smiled, a small smile, but full of meaning. "Come here," she said to Salvatore, her voice weak, yet carrying the tone of an order. Salvatore walked over and stopped beside the bed, his face unreadable as always, but something in his gaze had shifted. Kathleen looked at him longer than most people dared, then nodded slowly, as if she'd confirmed something to herself. Then she turned to Gianna and tightened her grip on her daughter's hand. "You know," she whispered, "I loved your father from the first moment I saw him. He was a driver. I was a middle-class Irish girl. Everyone said we didn't belong together, but love doesn't care about those things." "Mom," Gianna started, but Kathleen gave a faint shake of her head. "Let me finish. I don't have much time." Gianna felt her heart splinter at those words. "Sweetheart," Kathleen continued, her voice growing weaker with each sentence, "your life has been all darkness. I know. I've watched you fight alone for too long. But don't be afraid of the dark if you find someone to hold your hand through it. Sometimes the light comes from places we least expect." She glanced at Salvatore again, then looked back at Gianna. "Let yourself be loved, my girl. That's what your father wanted most for you, and it's what I want most before I go." 3 days later, Kathleen Russo began to fade, even as the doctors did everything they could. Her body was exhausted after years of fighting cancer, and the surgery, though successful, had taken the last strength she had left. At 4:17 in the morning on the third day, Kathleen Russo died in her sleep, her hand still clasped in her daughter's, her face peaceful like an angel finally coming home. Gianna sat by her mother's bed for hours afterward, unable to cry. She'd run out of tears a long time ago. She just sat there, holding the hand that was slowly cooling, and felt part of her soul die with it. Salvatore arrived that morning and began handling everything. He called a funeral home in Oak Park, the best in the city. He arranged a 2-day visitation, so friends and acquaintances could come and pay their respects. He secured a plot at Mount Carmel Cemetery, right beside Antonio Russo's grave, so husband and wife could rest together after 15 years apart. He didn't ask Gianna. He didn't wait for her to decide. He simply did what had to be done, quietly and efficiently, as if taking care of her was the most natural thing in the world. And through the days of the funeral, the days when Gianna felt like she was walking along the edge of an abyss, Salvatore stayed with her every moment. He stood behind her as she accepted condolences from people she couldn't even remember by name. He drove her home when she was too exhausted to stand upright. He didn't say much, didn't make promises, didn't comfort her with empty phrases. He was simply there, and somehow, that was enough. 1 week after the funeral, Gianna stood at the gates of the Benedetti estate for the last time. She'd spent 7 days in her empty apartment, staring at the cracked wall and trying to put the shattered pieces of her life back into some kind of order. Her mother was gone. Her father had been gone for years. She had no one left in this world, and the only thing she still had was a mess of feelings she didn't know what to do with. She couldn't keep working here, not because the work was too hard, but because she couldn't look at Salvatore every day without thinking about everything he'd done for her. The hospital bills, the funeral, the long nights sitting beside her in the hospital waiting room, his silent presence through the darkest days of her life. She owed him too much, and she didn't understand why he'd done any of it. Gianna walked into the mansion and went straight to the study where she knew Salvatore would be. She didn't knock. She just pushed the door open and stepped in the way she had the last time, when she discovered the truth about her father. Salvatore sat behind the desk, an untouched glass of whiskey in front of him, his dark eyes lifting to her as she entered. He didn't look surprised, as if he already knew she was coming. "I'm here to submit my resignation," Gianna said, her voice calmer than she felt. She placed an envelope on his desk, beside his whiskey glass. "Thank you for everything you've done, but I can't stay here anymore." Salvatore looked at the envelope, then at her. He didn't touch it. "Why?" Gianna laughed, a bitter sound with no joy in it. "Why? Because I owe you a debt I'll never be able to repay in my entire life. Because every time I look at you, I think about my mother. I think about my father. I think about everything your family has taken and given back. Because I don't understand what you want from me, and it's driving me insane." She took a deep breath, trying to steady the tremor that was starting to creep into her voice. "Because I can't look at you without feeling like everything is too complicated. Because I don't know where I stand in your life, and I don't want to keep guessing." Salvatore stood. The movement was slow and deliberate, like a panther closing in on its prey. Gianna instinctively stepped back, then back again, until her shoulders met the wall behind her. Salvatore stopped less than a step away, close enough that she could feel the heat coming off his body. Yet he kept the distance, not touching her. His black eyes looked down at her, and for the first time since she'd known him, she saw something beneath the icy surface. Something burning, something hungry, something dangerous. "You want to know what I want," Salvatore said, his voice low and rough like the growl of an animal. "I want you to stop being my maid. I want you to stay. Not as an employee, not as someone who owes me, but as something else." Gianna's heart slammed against her ribs. She knew she should run. She knew she should shove him away and leave before she did something she'd regret. But her feet wouldn't move. And a part of her, the part she'd tried to bury for so long, didn't want to leave. "You're mafia," she said, her breath coming fast even as she tried to control it. "You kill people. You live in a world I don't belong to. You're everything I should stay away from." Salvatore tilted his head, his black eyes catching the dim light of the room. "Yes," he said, with no apology in his voice. "I'm all of that. I kill people. I give orders to torture. I run an empire built on blood and tears. I'm the darkness you should run from." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice softened a fraction, almost vulnerable. "And you're still standing here." The word he used, "you," hit Gianna like a tidal wave. All this time, he'd always called her formally, keeping distance through language. But now, in this dark room, with the space between them so small she could count each breath he took, something had changed. Gianna didn't know which of them moved first. Maybe it was her. Maybe it was him. Maybe it was both at once. She only knew that in the next moment, her hand fisted in the collar of Salvatore's suit jacket, pulled him down, and their mouths met. The kiss wasn't gentle. It was full of anger, full of pain, full of years of loneliness and hunger held back too long. Gianna poured all her grief into that kiss, all her loss, all her confusion, all the feelings she didn't know how to name. And Salvatore answered her with equal ferocity, one hand wrapped around her waist, pulling her tight to his chest. The other slid into her hair, tilting her head so he could kiss her deeper. He kissed her like she was air, and he was drowning. He kissed her like this was the last time and the first. He kissed her like the darkness in him had finally found its light. When they broke apart, both of them were breathing hard. Salvatore's forehead rested against hers, his eyes still shut tight. Gianna could feel his heartbeat under her palm, fast and strong, matching her own. "There's no going back after this," Salvatore whispered, his voice rough. "If you stay with everything I am. Darkness and light, blood and flowers, all of it." Gianna opened her eyes and looked into the black depth of the man in front of her. She saw danger there. She saw violence. But she also saw something else. Something meant only for her. Something he'd never let anyone else see. "I know," she said, and she pulled him down again. 1 week after that first kiss, Gianna moved into the Benedetti estate. She didn't bring much because she didn't have much to bring. Just a small suitcase with a few old outfits, a few photos of her parents, and the silver bracelet her mother had worn her entire life. Salvatore gave her a private room in the east wing of the mansion, a room 10 times larger than the shabby studio she'd had on the south side, a king-size bed with Italian silk sheets, a private bathroom with a marble tub, a closet bigger than her old living room, even though it was still empty because she had nothing to hang inside it. But every night, that room sat untouched by her. Every night, Gianna found her way to the master bedroom on the 3rd floor, where Salvatore waited for her in the dark. They didn't talk much on those nights. They didn't need words. Their bodies spoke in a language of their own, a language written in breath, in touch, in whispers made for the night. Gianna learned how to exist in Salvatore's world. She learned not to flinch when gunshots cracked at 3 in the morning. She learned to recognize which footsteps belonged to the guards on patrol and which ones might signal a threat. She learned to keep her face calm when she passed tense meetings in the study, where Salvatore sat at the head of the table with eyes cold as ice and a voice that could decide whether a man lived or died. And she learned to wipe blood off the marble floor before dawn, the way she used to when she was only the housekeeper. Only now with a deeper understanding of where that blood came from. Enzo Benedetti, Salvatore's younger brother, watched her with suspicion and caution at first. He was 31, quicker to anger than his brother, with curly black hair and brown eyes that always carried a flame that was hard to control. He didn't trust women who came close to the family, especially after Francesca. But little by little, Enzo's attitude shifted. He saw that Gianna didn't tremble when she witnessed what happened inside this house. He saw how calmly she handled situations that would make other women faint, and he saw the way his brother looked at her, in a way Salvatore had never looked at anyone else. One afternoon, when Gianna was reading in the garden, Enzo sat down beside her. "You're the first person who's made my brother smile in years," he said, his voice no longer hostile. "I don't know who you are or where you came from, but for that, I'll give you a chance." Gianna nodded and said nothing, but she understood it was the highest kind of acceptance she could ever get from Enzo Benedetti. Still, not everyone in the family was that easy. One evening, a servant came to tell her that Mrs. Benedetti wanted to see her in her private sitting room. Gianna followed, her heart pounding, and stepped into a space decorated in an old Victorian style, where Carlotta Benedetti sat in an armchair like a queen on a throne. "Sit down," she ordered, not offered. Gianna sat. Carlotta looked her up and down with a cold, measuring stare, then sighed. "Who do you think you are?" she asked, her tone calm but filled with contempt. "A maid from the south side who thinks she can walk into this world and survive." Gianna kept her back straight and didn't lower her head. "I don't think anything, ma'am. I'm only where your son wants me to be." Carlotta gave a cold laugh. "My son is blind with desire. He'll realize his mistake soon enough. But by then, it may already be too late." She leaned forward, her black eyes identical to Salvatore's, but without a trace of warmth. "Listen carefully," she said slowly. "In this world, women are weakness. They're how enemies strike. If you stay with Salvatore, you'll die. Or worse, he'll die trying to protect you. Do you want his death on your conscience?" Gianna didn't answer. She didn't know how to answer. Carlotta's words clung to her mind like tiny needles, planting doubt inside her heart. She left that room with heavier steps than when she'd entered. At the same time, on the other side of the city, news was spreading through the underworld like wildfire. Salvatore Benedetti, the man they called Il Silenzio, the man with no weakness, the man cold as ice and ruthless as the devil, had a woman he cared about, a woman he'd do anything to protect. In the Carbone family mansion, Francesca and her father, Vittorio, sat facing each other at a long dining table. A photo of Gianna lay between them, taken in secret while she walked in the garden at the Benedetti estate. "So Benedetti has a weakness now," Vittorio said, a cruel smile spreading across his thin lips. "Bring Bruno here. We've got a new plan." Carlotta's words haunted Gianna for days after that. She started to wonder if the older woman was right, if Gianna's presence truly put Salvatore in danger. She needed time alone to think, needed a quiet place to face the doubts gnawing at her soul. So one morning, she told Salvatore she wanted to visit her mother's grave, alone. "No," Salvatore said immediately, his dark eyes turning even darker. "It isn't safe. You're not going anywhere alone." Gianna looked at him, chin lifted. "I need space, Salvatore. I need time with my mother without guards standing behind me. I'll be gone and back within 2 hours." "Nothing's going to happen." They argued for almost half an hour. In the end, Salvatore relented on the condition that she keep her phone with her and call him the moment she was done. He wasn't happy. That much was obvious in the way his jaw clenched and the worry in his eyes as he watched her drive away. But he let her go, because he knew she needed it, and it was the biggest mistake either of them would ever make. Mount Carmel Cemetery was quiet in the early morning. Gianna parked and walked along the gravel path to her parents' graves, side by side under the shadow of an old oak tree. She knelt in front of her mother's headstone and placed a bouquet of white chrysanthemums she'd bought on the way. "Mom," she whispered, her fingers tracing the carved name Kathleen Russo, "I don't know what I'm doing anymore. I don't know if I'm making the right choice. You told me not to fear the dark if I find someone to hold my hand through it. But what if that darkness swallows both of us?" She was praying when she heard footsteps crunching on gravel. She looked up, and the blood in her body turned to ice. 5 men were walking toward her. 4 of them wore black and carried guns. And leading them was a face she recognized instantly, even though she'd never met him in person. Bruno Carbone, Diego, the man who'd lured her to the Velvet Room that night. "Hello, Gianna," he said, a cruel smile spreading across a handsome face that looked devil-made. "We finally meet. You're Diego." Gianna stood, survival instinct forcing her to step back, but there was nowhere to run. The 4 gunmen had her surrounded from every side. "That's right," Bruno nodded, moving closer. "Diego was a fake name. Too bad about our date that night, huh? But don't worry, today I'm going to make it up to you." Gianna didn't even have time to react before a gunman behind her struck the base of her skull. The world went black. When she woke, she was tied to an iron chair in an abandoned warehouse, the stink of motor oil and rust filling her lungs. Her head throbbed, and she tasted blood in her mouth from a cut on her lip. But she didn't cry. She didn't beg. She just sat there, her gray-blue eyes cold as ice, staring at Bruno as he stood in front of her with a video camera in his hand. "Smile for the camera, sweetheart," he said. "Your lover's waiting to see this." At the same time, back at the Benedetti mansion, Salvatore's phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number, with a video attached. He hit play, and his world collapsed. Gianna appeared on the screen, tied to a chair, her face bruised, but her eyes still proud and fearless. The camera panned, and Francesca Carbone stepped into frame with a triumphant smile. "Hi, Sal," she said, her voice sweet as venom. "I've got a gift for you." She moved behind Gianna and set a hand on her shoulder in a gesture of ownership. "It's simple. Sign over the entire Benedetti empire to the Carbone family, and you'll get this girl back. Alive. If not, well, you'll get her back in a few different boxes. You've got 24 hours. Don't try to find us, and don't call the police. You know what happens." The video ended. For a moment, the room went completely silent. Then Salvatore roared, a sound of rage and pain like a wild animal. He hurled the phone at the wall, the screen shattering. He swept everything off the desk, papers flying, the whiskey glass exploding into 100 pieces across the floor. Tommy and Enzo rushed in at the noise. They'd never seen Salvatore like this. The man they called Il Silenzio, the man cold as ice in every situation, was losing control completely. His eyes burned like hell, and his hands shook with fury. Enzo looked at the broken phone on the floor, looked at the madness on his brother's face, and understood instantly what had happened. "They've got her," he said. Not a question. Salvatore didn't answer, only stood there breathing hard like a wounded beast. Enzo drew in a slow breath and asked the question he knew he had to ask. "What do they want?" "Everything," Salvatore growled. "They want the whole empire." Enzo went quiet for a long moment. He stared at his brother with something complicated in his eyes, then asked, "Are you really going to trade everything you and Dad built, everything we bled to protect, for one woman?" Salvatore turned to his brother, his black eyes like two bottomless pits, filled with darkness and deadly resolve. "No," he said, his voice cold as steel. "I'm not trading anything. I'm taking back what's mine." He turned to Tommy, his voice returning to the terrifying calm of a man who'd made a decision. "Gather everyone. Everyone. Tonight, we hunt." In the pitch-dark warehouse, Gianna sat on the cold iron chair and calculated. She didn't panic. She didn't cry. She'd survived her father's death at 12, fought alone for 15 years, watched her mother fade in a hospital bed. If life had taught her one thing, it was that no one came to save her except herself. She studied the room in the faint light filtering through dusty windows. 2 guards stood near the entrance, guns tucked at their hips, chatting and glancing at her now and then. They didn't see her as a threat. A woman tied up, thin, bruised. What could she do? That was their mistake. Gianna felt the hairpin still clipped in her hair, the only pin they hadn't bothered to take because they thought it was harmless. She heard her father's voice rise from a distant memory. Antonio Russo had taught her a lot before he died. How to defend herself, how to sense danger, and how to pick cuffs with a hairpin, a skill he said he hoped she'd never need. Today, she would. Gianna let her head slump as if she'd passed out. Slowly, carefully, she bent and used her teeth to pull the hairpin free, hiding it in her palm. Then she began working at the rope around her wrists, her fingers trembling but precise, the way her father had taught her. It took nearly an hour of keeping her face slack whenever a guard glanced over, an hour of swallowing down any sound when the rope bit into her skin, an hour of forcing every ounce of willpower not to quit. Finally, the rope loosened. She kept her hands behind her back as if she were still bound, waiting for the right moment. The moment came when one of the guards stepped outside to smoke, leaving only one behind. He was hunched over his phone, completely careless. Gianna moved. She rose without a sound, slipped behind him like a ghost, and before he could react, she swung the iron chair she'd been tied to straight into his head. He dropped like a sack. Gianna crouched, took the gun from his belt, and checked the magazine the way her father had taught her. Still full, she headed for the door, her heart pounding wild but her grip on the gun steady. She'd just put her hand on the handle when the door burst open. Bruno Carbone stood there, eyes wide with shock at the sight of her free. Then he laughed, arrogant and dripping with contempt. "Who do you think you are?" "A hero." He stepped closer, reaching as if to rip the gun from her hand. "Look at you. Your hands are shaking. You don't even know how to shoot." Gianna didn't shake. She squeezed the trigger. The gunshot exploded through the warehouse. Bruno went down, clutching his shoulder as blood sprayed, his mouth hanging open in disbelief. She'd shot him, enough to drop him, not enough to kill. She didn't want to kill anyone if she didn't have to. She ran. She vaulted past Bruno, twisting on the floor, shoved the heavy door open, and burst outside. The night air slammed into her face like a slap, bitter and cold. She was in an abandoned industrial zone on the outskirts of Chicago, surrounded by crumbling warehouses and empty lots. She didn't know where to go, but she ran anyway. Then she heard gunfire, not behind her, but ahead. Automatic bursts, shouting, engines roaring. She stopped, her heart trying to leap out of her chest, when a convoy of black vehicles emerged from the dark, and from the lead car, Salvatore Benedetti stepped out. He was holding a gun, his black suit smeared with blood, his eyes like 2 deep pits filled with hellfire. Around him, his men were fighting the Carbone crew, gunfire cracking across the open yard. But he didn't look at them. He looked only at her. Gianna stood under the thin moonlight, the gun in her hand still smoking, her face streaked with an enemy's blood, her hair wild, her dress torn in several places. She didn't look like a victim waiting to be saved. She looked like a warrior who'd walked out of her own battle. Salvatore moved toward her fast, as if he was afraid she'd disappear if he didn't touch her immediately. When he reached her, he didn't speak. He just pulled her in, crushed her to his chest like she was the most precious thing in the world he'd nearly lost. Around them, the fight still raged, shots still cracked, men still shouted, but in that moment, only the two of them existed. "I love you," Salvatore whispered into her hair, his voice rough and breaking in a way she'd never heard from him. "I love you, Gianna. I thought I was going to lose you. I thought I'd never get to say this to you." Gianna lifted her face and looked into the dark eyes of the man in front of her, eyes wet now. She raised her hand to his face and felt warmth beneath skin that always seemed cold. "I know," she said, her voice strangely calm in the middle of a battlefield. "I love you too. That's why I didn't die." Salvatore bent and kissed her. Between blood and gunpowder, between chaos and death, they kissed like it was the last time and the first. And when they pulled apart, the gunfire had gone quiet. The battle was over. Salvatore's men stood around them, some injured, but no one dead. The Carbone crew, the ones still alive, were on their knees with their hands cuffed behind their backs. Francesca was nowhere to be seen. Bruno was groaning in his own blood. Salvatore didn't look at any of them. He looked only at her, as if the whole world had collapsed into nothing but the gray-blue eyes staring back at him. "Let's go home," he said. Gianna nodded. Home. 2 weeks after the rescue, Salvatore made a decision no one in the family dared to challenge. He was going to present Gianna publicly to all of Chicago's upper class. The annual charity event at the Drake Hotel was the perfect opportunity. It was where the underworld families put on their respectable masks, where killers wore three-piece suits and traded business cards like honorable men. And it was where Salvatore would announce to the entire world that Gianna Russo belonged to him. That morning, a team of stylists was brought to the mansion. Gianna sat still as a statue while they did her hair, applied her makeup, and helped her into the black Valentino dress Salvatore had custom ordered for her. The gown brushed the floor, made of glossy black silk, clinging to her like a second skin, with a high slit that revealed her long legs every time she moved. Around her neck was a Cartier diamond necklace that glittered under the lights, and matching diamond earrings hung from her ears. When she looked at herself in the mirror, she barely recognized the woman staring back. This wasn't Gianna Russo, the housekeeper from the South Side. This was someone else entirely, someone who belonged to red carpets and camera flashes. But inside, she was still herself. She would never forget that. Salvatore waited at the bottom of the stairs, in a perfectly tailored black three-piece suit. When she appeared at the top and began to descend, he stood motionless, his dark eyes widening as if he were seeing the sun for the first time. "You're beautiful," he murmured when she reached him. "So beautiful I can't breathe." Gianna smiled and set her hand on his chest. "Don't stop breathing. I need you alive to take me in tonight." The black Bentley brought them to the Drake Hotel, where photographers' flashes were already waiting outside the entrance. When they stepped out, the murmurs rose like a tide. Everyone knew who Salvatore Benedetti was, but no one knew who the woman at his side was. Reporters shouted questions. Cameras flashed non-stop. Salvatore placed a hand at Gianna's waist, kept her close, and led her across the carpet as if they'd done this 1,000 times. Inside the hotel, every gaze snapped toward them. Men in expensive suits turned their heads. Women in evening gowns whispered behind fans. Gianna could feel them judging her, trying to figure out who she was and where she came from. She lifted her chin and kept walking. Then Francesca Carbone appeared. She was as beautiful as ever in a blood-red dress, her lips curved in a poisonous smile. The failed kidnapping hadn't stopped her from coming, because in this world, appearances were everything, and no one dared openly accuse Vittorio Carbone's daughter. "Salvatore," Francesca called, her voice sweet as snake venom. "And this is," she went on, pretending she didn't know who Gianna was. "Let me guess, the maid from the South Side." She turned to the crowd around them and lifted her champagne glass. "Do you all know? This girl used to clean Salvatore's floors. She used to scrub toilets and wash his laundry. And now she's standing here wearing Cartier diamonds, thinking she belongs. A few scoffing laughs rose from the crowd. Gianna felt heat flood her face. But she didn't back away. She didn't lower her head. She stepped out of Salvatore's protective arm and faced Francesca. "You're right," Gianna said, her voice calm and clear enough for the whole crowd to hear. "I used to be a housekeeper. I cleaned floors, scrubbed toilets, washed laundry. I did it for 4 years to pay the hospital bills for my mother while she was dying of cancer." The room went still. Even Francesca froze, not expecting Gianna to admit it instead of denying it. "And I'm proud of it," Gianna continued. "I'm proud because I did everything with my own hands, with my own sweat, without leaning on a family name or my parents' money." Her eyes cut to Francesca like a knife. "And you? What do you have besides the Carbone name?" The silence stretched. Then applause broke from the corner of the room. An older woman Gianna recognized as Margaret Thorne, the matriarch of one of Chicago's oldest families, was clapping with an amused smile. "This girl's got fire," she said to the people around her. "I like her." And just like that, the air shifted. The whispers changed from contempt to curiosity, from judgment to respect. Gianna's honesty, her refusal to pretend she was someone else, won them over in a way no designer gown ever could. Salvatore stepped beside Gianna, wrapped an arm around her waist, and lifted his champagne glass. The crowd turned to him, and in a voice that carried across the ballroom, he declared, "This is Gianna Russo, the woman I chose, not because she belongs to any family, not because of how much money she has, but because she's the strongest, most resilient, and most beautiful person I've ever known." His gaze swept over the room, his dark eyes cold as ice. "And I'm saying this once, so everyone here hears me. Anyone who touches her, touches me. Anyone who threatens her, threatens me. Anyone who hurts her will get it back tenfold from me." It wasn't just a declaration of love. It was a declaration of war. It was a commitment. And when Gianna looked at Francesca, she saw the other woman's face go pale as paper. Francesca knew she'd lost. Not because Salvatore was stronger, but because Gianna, the maid from the South Side, had won in a way Francesca never could. 6 months had passed since that night at the Drake Hotel. 6 months in which Gianna had lived in the Benedetti mansion not as a maid or a guest, but as part of the family. 6 months in which she learned how to run the house, learned how to stand beside Salvatore in meetings that mattered, learned how to become what he needed her to be without losing herself in the process. Mrs. Benedetti was still cold, but she'd stopped opposing her openly. Maybe she'd seen the way Gianna saved her son with her own strength that night in the warehouse. Maybe she'd realized Gianna wasn't Salvatore's weakness. She was his strength. The Carbone family had been weakened after the failed kidnapping. Vittorio was still alive, but his power had shaken loose. Francesca vanished from Chicago, rumored to have fled to Italy to escape Salvatore's wrath. Bruno now walked with a cane, because the bullet Gianna put through his shoulder had caused permanent nerve damage. And life went on, carrying everything it always carried. One spring evening, Salvatore told Gianna to dress up because he wanted to take her to dinner. She didn't ask where, because she'd learned Salvatore liked surprises. She wore a simple but elegant deep blue dress, left her hair down the way Salvatore said he liked best, and climbed into the Bentley waiting outside. When the car stopped in front of the Velvet Room, Gianna's heart hit an uneven beat. She stared at the restaurant through the window, remembering the night she'd walked in with $273 in her purse and a heart full of naive hope. The night she'd been humiliated and nearly thrown out like a beggar. The night Salvatore had walked through that door and changed her life forever. "I wanted to bring you back to where it started," Salvatore said, as if he'd read her thoughts. They stepped inside, and Gianna knew instantly something was different. The restaurant was empty, not a single guest besides them. The vacant tables were decorated with white roses and flickering candles, and standing beside the familiar window table where she'd waited for Diego 6 months ago was Preston. The waiter from that night, the one who'd humiliated her in front of the entire room, now stood with his head bowed and his shoulders trembling. When Gianna and Salvatore approached, he bent low in a bow that nearly touched the floor. "Sir, ma'am," he said, his voice shaking. "It's an honor to serve you tonight." Gianna looked at Preston and remembered the contempt in his eyes, the way he'd said out loud that she didn't belong here. She could have asked Salvatore to punish him. She could have made him lose his job, lose more than that. But she didn't. "Thank you," she said, and nothing else. Then she sat in the chair Salvatore pulled out for her, at the same table, by the same window, looking out at the same glittering Chicago night. But everything was different. She was different. Dinner unfolded in a warm, peaceful hush. They talked about the future, about the plans Salvatore was building for his empire, about the role Gianna would hold at his side. When dessert arrived, a small chocolate cake with a single candle, Gianna frowned because it wasn't her birthday. Then Salvatore stood and knelt. Gianna's heart stopped. She stared at the man in front of her, the man who 6 months ago had been only a shadow in a luxurious mansion, a boss she hadn't dared look in the eye. Now he was on one knee, holding a small black velvet box, his dark eyes fixed on her with a tenderness she didn't think he was capable of. Inside was a heart-cut diamond, sparkling under candlelight. "This ring belonged to my grandmother," Salvatore said, his voice rougher than usual. "She was the only woman I ever respected until I met you, and she'd want you to have it. Gianna Russo," he continued, taking her hand, "will you be my wife? The queen of this empire, the only person I trust, the only person I love, until death, and maybe even after that." Gianna looked at him, tears spilling down her cheeks without her even trying to wipe them away. She remembered that night, sitting at this same table, waiting for a man who never came. She remembered the humiliation, the abandonment, the certainty that she wasn't worth anything, and she looked into Salvatore's eyes. The man who'd seen her when no one else did. The man who chose her when the world said she wasn't enough. "I've belonged to you since the night you truly saw me," she said, her voice breaking. "My answer is yes. Always yes." Salvatore slid the ring onto her finger, then rose and pulled her into his arms. He kissed her in the empty restaurant, under flickering candles and white roses, and from somewhere, applause broke out. Preston was clapping, tears in his eyes, maybe moved, maybe relieved he wouldn't be punished. The other staff clapped too, and Gianna laughed through her tears, realizing that at last, after everything she'd survived, she was the one who was chosen. The wedding took place on an autumn afternoon, when yellow leaves drifted softly through the garden of the Benedetti estate. It wasn't a lavish ceremony with hundreds of guests, the way people would expect from the most powerful family in Chicago. It was only the closest circle, about 30 people, gathered beneath a white floral arch arranged with quiet elegance. Enzo stood beside his brother as best man, and for the first time Gianna saw him smile for real. Tommy stood guard at the gate like always, except today he wore a suit instead of a leather jacket, and even his hard eyes softened when he watched the bride walk down the aisle of flowers. And in the front row, Carlotta Benedetti sat in a silver-gray dress, her back straight as ever. But when Gianna passed her on the way to Salvatore, she did something no one expected. She nodded, a small nod, almost invisible, but Gianna understood. It was acceptance. It was acknowledgement that Gianna had proven she was worthy, not through bloodline or wealth, but through strength and loyalty, through the way she saved herself in that warehouse that night, through the way she stood beside Salvatore through every shadow without shaking. The ceremony was simple, but it carried weight. When Salvatore spoke his vows, his voice trembled slightly for the first time since Gianna had known him, and when she answered, tears ran down her cheeks. Not from sorrow, but because at last, after everything she'd lost, she'd found where she belonged. 2 years after the wedding, Gianna stood at the master bedroom window, looking out over Chicago at night. The city glittered beneath her like a carpet of black diamonds, full of mystery and danger, yet beautiful in its own way. Her hand rested on the round curve of her belly, where her first child was growing larger every day. A baby girl, the doctor had told them the week before. A girl who would be born into the Benedetti family, with everything that meant. Gianna felt Salvatore behind her before she heard his footsteps. He always moved like a ghost, silent, but she'd learned to sense his presence by instinct. His arms wrapped around her waist, his hands settling over her belly, his chin resting on her shoulder. They stood in silence for a long time, watching the city below. "Do you ever regret it?" Salvatore asked, his whisper against her ear. "Regret choosing this life? Regret choosing me?" Gianna went quiet and thought. She thought of everything she'd lost. Her father, her mother, the ordinary life she used to dream about. She thought of everything she'd seen in the past 2 years. Violence, blood, choices she knew would haunt her to the end of her days. She thought of nights she woke from nightmares, days she wondered who she'd become. "Every day," she answered honestly. "Every day I regret it at least once." She felt Salvatore go still behind her, But she continued before he could speak. And every day, I choose you again. Salvatore let out a breath, as if he'd been holding it without realizing. He held her tighter, his lips brushing her hair. Why? He asked. Why do you keep choosing me when you know exactly who I am? When you know what I've done? Gianna turned in his arms and looked up into the dark eyes she'd fallen in love with on the first night at the Velvet Room. Because you saw me, she said. When the whole world looked at me and only saw a maid, you saw me for real. You saw strength in me before I could even see it myself. You didn't try to change me into someone else. You just loved me for being me. She placed her hand on his chest, where his heart was beating hard. And because inside this darkness, she said, inside the man the whole city fears, I found a man who sat beside me all night in the hospital when my mother was dying. A man who cried when he thought he was losing me. A man who loves me enough to let me be myself. Salvatore didn't speak. He only bent and kissed her, slow and gentle, as if they had a lifetime to kiss. And they did. When they pulled apart, Gianna turned back to the window, her hand still on her belly. She felt her daughter move inside her. A small kick, like the baby was greeting her. You'll be born into darkness, she whispered to the child who hadn't arrived yet. You'll grow up in a world your mother never thought she belonged in. But I promise you, I'll teach you to find the light. I'll teach you that where you come from doesn't define who you are. I'll teach you that real strength comes from inside, not from names or money. And I'll love you, no matter who you become, no matter what path you choose. Salvatore set his hand over hers, both of them holding the round curve together. And I'll burn anyone who dares to block that light, he said, his voice both threatening and tender in a way only Salvatore could manage. I'll protect my two girls at any cost. Gianna smiled and leaned her head against his chest. Outside the window, Chicago still glittered in the night, full of darkness and light, danger and beauty. Secrets only those who lived inside it could understand. And here, in this mansion, a new family was beginning. Not perfect, not normal, but real. Sometimes love doesn't come from the brightest places. Sometimes it blooms in the deepest dark, where broken souls find each other and decide to heal together. And sometimes the most beautiful flowers grow from soil watered by tears. Gianna and Salvatore's story reminds us that life doesn't always give us what we want, but if we're strong enough and brave enough to trust, we'll find what we need, that our origins don't define us, the way we face hardship does, that sometimes the one we love most comes from the place we least expect, and that no matter how thick the darkness is, there's always light waiting for those brave enough to look for it. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, hit like, and share this video so we can keep bringing you more moving stories every day. How do you feel about Gianna's journey? From a maid who was humiliated to the woman standing at the head of an empire. Have you ever lived through a moment when everything seemed to collapse, only for a new door to open? We'd truly love to hear what's deep in your heart in the comments below. Thank you for staying with us through this long story. Wishing you and your family good health, a happy life, and peaceful days ahead. Goodbye, and we'll see you in the next video.